Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with John Derry, distinguished Christian higher education leader with over 5 decades of service, to talk about board governance. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we are honored to have as our guest this week, John Derry. John has served in Christian higher education for over 50 years. It sounds more if I say 5 decades. So over 5 decades, but his last assignment as president of Hope International University. And John has been connected with ABHE for many years, but more recently, providing some programmatic leadership over our board governance training initiative, which we'll talk about a little bit here today. But I've invited him to talk about, just in general terms, on a subject that he is passionate about, and that's effective board governance. So welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, Philip. It's great to be with you, and I have a great appreciation for your work with ABHE and the involvement I've had over the years, working at Bible colleges and Christian liberal arts schools, and just appreciate the ministry it has, and especially to see the growth and the expansion of the ABHE over the years.
Yeah,
how it's become so much more a part of many schools today.
Yeah, and you've been a big part of that, and you've engaged with us as a participant, but now also helping us out with some of this board governance training that we're doing. So we're going to get specifically into that here in a second. But to kick off our conversation, just so our audience can get to know you a little bit, John, talk to us about a defining moment in your life that God used to significantly shape kind of who you are and where you've ended up in life.
Well, it's an interesting observation. As I reflect back on my career, I can think of many times when there were opportunities to serve God in different ways. And one of the challenges I think that many leaders face is, how do I know when it's the right time to leave or to take another opportunity? And so this is more than a defining moment. I think it would become a defining perspective for me. It goes back to a time when I had an opportunity to go to another school to serve, and trying to decide whether I should leave or not. And at that same time, I was teaching a young adult Sunday school class at our church. And we were going through the book by Henry Blackaby called Experiencing God. I know many people may have read that book. And it was kind of at that time that I began to realize that sometimes what I'm wrestling with is I'm thinking about God's will as if there was, let's make a deal. And there's 3 doors out there, and I have to choose the right one. And in reality, what I was wanting was a map, say, this is where you should be going. But God was giving me a compass. And the premise of that book is that you need to look where God is at work and join him there. And so that and a couple Proverbs, one we've all used many times is trust in the Lord with all your heart, do not lean on your own understanding. And the second was Proverbs 16:9, where it says a man's mind plans his ways, but God directs his steps. And that's when I began to realize that God didn't give me a roadmap. He gave me a compass and said, you go this direction and make the decision and I'll bless it. And so I look back on my career and can see exactly how God directed my steps each way, even today, and opportunities to serve like I had with the ABHE for the last few years. I feel as if it was God using past experience to prepare you for your next place of service.
Oh, I love that perspective. And you've quoted one of my favorite verses, Proverbs 16:9, that I've used so many times in my own life. And you're so right. We, in our humanness, we want to know, okay, should I do this or that? And I think as God directs us, that's the wrong question. And I think you framed it correctly, to say, look, go where God is moving. And that could mean that you have 2 or 3 or 4 different options, right? And still be within God's will. And then that discernment comes with, okay, maybe there are other priorities in your life that may drive towards a particular decision, and yet you're still within God's plan for your life. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and you can see how you look back on your life and you see how those pieces kind of fit together. And so you best understand God's will in retrospect, I think.
Yep. Yep. And we're not going to get too deep theologically here, but somewhere in the midst of that is his sovereignty as well as our choice as we're working through life. So I'll let our theologians figure out which side of the fence that is. But
Yeah.
so let's talk about board governance. You've been involved with ABHE's board governance training ever since its inception. Several dozen ABHE member schools have gone through the program. So from all of the experiences that you've had, even outside of ABHE, but then also within ABHE, as you reflect back, what would you say are the three most critical mistakes you see boards making?
Yeah, it's been a great opportunity to work with. Collectively, we've done almost 50 schools on the ABHE during this time. And as we've done that, I believe that good governance starts with your board composition. And if you don't build the board around competent, committed men and women, you have an uphill battle. And so I think you need to have a well-defined process that's well-organized in identifying and vetting new board members. You can do that in several ways. There's a board matrix that you can use to kind of say, okay, this is the kind of member we're looking for. You need to have a board profile, and it's the makeup of your board, including their background, professional qualifications, their experience, their age, just this kind of diversity that helps you put together a really good board that represents your constituents, history of this institution, and different kind of perspectives. So I think sometimes boards sort of just evolve in a way that it's not intentional. It's more by default. Well, here's somebody that I know that will be on the board. So I think that's often one of the mistakes that we've observed. And the second one, I think, is that sometimes boards begin to focus on non-essentials. We've all heard about time management and the tyranny of the urgent. And so what happens at a board meeting is there'll be an issue or a problem arise, a crisis or something like that. And it distracts us into begin to thinking about things that really are not critical to the condition of the college. And you aren't able to make an informed decision. So as we've gone through these 50 schools in the last few years, the number one thing that people have always come back to us and asked for after our training has been, do you have an example of a dashboard of key performance indicators? And what that is, it's an easy way for the board to look at some of the most critical components of the institution's health. And so you need to ask the administration to be sure that they're providing you with that selection of identifying what is most important to success. And it's something that's designed and developed in conjunction with the board and the administration. So collectively, you discuss this. And when you can come to a meeting and quickly look and see, here's where we have a red light, something that needs to have our attention. And you have this list of indicators that you're looking at. So that's the way the board can contribute to good solutions.
Yeah. And pause right there, because I think this is such a critical piece. And you give the example of KPIs as a way to keep boards focused on the things that they ought to be focused in on. So one of those things is providing data around those things that boards should be talking about. Without that kind of leadership, and I've seen this happen in church board contexts, I've seen it happen in college board contexts, in the void of not helping the board focus on what it is that they're supposed to they'll find something to focus in on. And sometimes, or I should say a lot of the times, undirected, it's focused in on the wrong things, on staff related issues that you've hired a CEO, you've hired a president, you've hired a senior pastor to take care of those things. The board should not be involved with them.
Oh, exactly. And there can be so many examples of that. Comes to mind, one quick one is, I remember on a board meeting, we had an hour and a half discussion of whether we should replace the roof on the married student housing. That's a decision that should have been easy to make, made by someone else, maybe a committee or something. But everyone has an opinion on those kinds of things. And the next thing you know, the meeting's over and you didn't even get around to some of the most critical things.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been in board meetings talking about budgets, right? Mm-hmm. We would have a conversation down to, should we really be spending $300 on goldfish as a snack for the for the children's ministry, or should it be $500? And are we shopping at the right places if we're having to spend $300? Should we go to Costco and spend $150? And that's and boards de-evolve. Now that's an extreme example, but if boards aren't focused on the right things, they will focus on something.
Yeah, and it's a good discussion. It's a good exercise for the administration and the board to wrestle with what information do we really want to know? What is important? And for us, it'll be, like what's our enrollment? What's our retention rate, graduation rates? What's our cash flow? And those things need to be done in such a way that there's a quick look at what it is that you're reporting to your trustees.
Yeah. And I've told boards, because they tend to get hung up on this, right? Where okay, so they're introduced to the concept of having KPIs and a dashboard. And so they've gone from 0 to 100 miles an hour, and they want all of these complexities and all of these data points. And, sometimes you need to learn how to crawl before you walk, before you jog, before you run. And a good next step is just, okay, so don't say that there's 20 data. You might get to that point, but what are the top 3 things that you need to know as a board member so that you could be effective at what you do? And I think there you can just start with something and then start building on them. And I've seen some of our boards have some pretty helpful and complex dashboards that board members can within seconds be able to see, okay, what's the health of this organization?
Exactly. And it can be refined over time. It doesn't have to be etched in stone. It changes as necessary. And it's called a dashboard for a reason. It's just like looking at the dashboard of your car and saying, do I have enough gas in the tank? How fast am I going? Yep. And if there's a red light that comes on, say, I better take it to a mechanic and get it repaired.
Great. So those are 2. Give us a third mistake that you see.
Typically, we have a rotation among our board members where they may serve 1 or 2 or 3-year terms, and then they rotate off, and you're always having a turnover on your board. And we sometimes assume that when somebody comes onto the board, that they know everything they should about how it operates. And so they don't have a good system of board orientation, and other than maybe introducing the board member to the trustees and say, here we have a new trustee coming on board. Here's where he served and his experience. And that's about it. And then they are tossed right into the typical board meeting, and they're expected to get up to speed on their own. So boards often don't have a well-structured board orientation. And so right now, one of the things that we're doing as part of our governance program is we're developing an online course, and this first course will be on board orientation. And our intent is to make this a course that you can provide to new trustees, that they can sit down in about an hour and a half and understand about accreditation and things of that nature that make us unique in biblical higher education.
That's great. It's almost like clearly defining what business we're in, right? So if you were to say, okay, we're playing the game of football, right? So here are the rules. Here's what a field is. Here are the players. This is how we play the game. There are 4 quarters, not 5 quarters. You're clearly identifying the parameters in which that board member is going to be operated. And absent from that, they'll again fill in the silence and potentially could be disruptive as a new board member coming in.
Yeah, and even to the extent of possibly assigning a new trustee to someone who's had more years on the board as their mentor or their coach, and they sit beside them at a board meeting. And so when something comes up and they say, what are they talking about? Or what is this terminology they're using, referring to when they use something that they're not their normal vocabulary? And they have this person that's there kind of coaching them along for the first 2 or 3 meetings.
Yep. Good. So board governance in higher education, there are boards all over the place, right? There are boards for-profit companies. There are not-for-profits, for churches. So the concept of board governance is across multiple industries. But when we talk about board governance in higher education, it is fundamentally different than any other board governance. So what makes higher education board governance so unique?
When you think of in the corporate world, often board members are compensated. And when you're working with nonprofits, and many nonprofits have things in common with higher education, the board members are not. They're volunteers. They're individuals who come to us from various backgrounds and things. And so it'll be, we have our own set of challenges, I guess you could say. There are different kinds of regulations that the government imposes upon higher education and then in the corporate world. Accreditation, for example, there's a long list of accreditation criteria, essentials that we're expected to comply with that would not be the case in most nonprofits or in the corporate world. And and I think the other thing that basically happens is you have in the corporate world stockholders. Mm-hmm. But as I look at it in higher education, we have stakeholders. Mm. And those would be the churches that we support, the ministries, social service agencies, our students, employers, the community. It's a long list. And we're not so concerned about the profit. Obviously, we don't want to be turning in a loss, but it's not a profit motive here. We're looking at the quality of education and the success of our graduates. Mm-hmm. It's not how much product we've sold or things of that nature. It's just like, are we preparing these men and women for a career of success in their chosen field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you made a great point there that is so true. I can't think of any other industry where there are so many stakeholders represented. Higher education, it's broad. You have your own internal stakeholders in faculty and staff and students, administrators, C-suite, board, but then even go in external, then you've got alumni, then you have local government, state government, federal government, then you have accreditation, and a lot of schools have more than just one accreditation. They may have specialized accreditors. So NASM or CSWE or other specialized accreditors. So they're a whole nother sector. Then there's the church. Then there are organizations within the community. I mean, the list just literally goes on. And a board member needs to be aware of the impact even a small institution has, and the number of stakeholders that an institution has is remarkably more than any other industry.
Oh, absolutely. And then I think probably the biggest difference we have is that ours is a spiritual enterprise.
There we go.
This is a kingdom of God perspective here. Mm-hmm. But we're saying what we're doing matters much more than just, like I said, the bottom line of profit, or maybe, and there's some great, wonderful nonprofit organizations out there, but ours has an eternal impact. Mm-hmm. And we just need to remember that when we're serving on a board of a Bible college, this is kingdom of God work. And it is a stewardship that's been entrusted to our trustees that said, this is God's work that you're doing here. And don't ever forget that.
And the accountability is so much higher too for board members. Yeah. Which is a lot to think of when a board member is asked to join a college board. It's all of the normal stuff that you'd expect a board member to do, but then you layer in the whole spiritual enterprise. Like there's a high level of biblical responsibility that you have as a leader leading other Christ followers that someday God will hold you even more accountable because of your work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for our presidents that are listening in, what would you say are some warning flags? Maybe they just have a sense of maybe things aren't quite right. But in your experiences, what are some of the warning flags that may indicate that there are governance challenges or issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah, reflecting back on literally hundreds of board meetings I've been to in my career, I would say probably one of the biggest things you look for is if you have a board that is not fully engaged. And by that, I mean, if you have poor attendance, and unfortunately, we've had some schools that we've worked with that when we've gone to do some of the governance training, that maybe half the members of the board show up, and you think, okay, that's a red flag, or there's no participation in the discussions. It's sort of a one-man show. It's the president reporting everything, and nobody's having any conversation or discussion or even debate about decisions that are being made, and people just kind of sit there and then they go home, or no financial support. We really encourage our boards to say you should shoot for 100% participation in contributing to the work of the school. We try not to say there's a minimum standard, although I've known some schools that have actually said this is what we expect from all of our trustees. to make it among their top 2 or 3 charitable giving. So if you don't have a board that's really engaged, that's a red flag that you need to address that in the proper way and do something.
Yeah. You mentioned the giving part of it, and it connects with something that you said earlier that I think is a critical piece, and that's in your board orientation. Even before the board orientation, board members ought to know, and I'm one that believes every board member should give, and I don't quantify that in my, as I'm working with the ABHE board. But it ought not to be a surprise that a board member comes in and, there's an expectation that I'm giving to this organ. It ought to be part of, the job description of a board member is that they're expected to give of their finances to the organization. Mm-hmm. And I'd go so far as that if that's a deal breaker, then hey, that's all right. There are other boards that you can serve on, but for us, and the reason for that is it gives presidents so much bigger of a handle when they're going for example. We've gone to trusts and asking for a grant proposal, and one of the questions that you're always asked in the process is what % of your board is giving to the organization. And in fact, you and I were on a call once that it wasn't just good enough to share that 85% of the board members were giving. Then the follow-up question was, well, what's wrong with the other 15%? Why aren't they giving? So it goes a long way to show that the board is in it for the organization when you're doing grant requests, but even just general fundraising. If you're sitting across the table from a donor and the donor asks a very significant question of, hey, if I'm going to give my resources, what do you have to demonstrate that everybody's on board with this? And it's not an uncommon question that donors ask is the board giving?
And I think probably another simple warning flag would be if you have a dysfunctional board, and this is rare that it happens to this extent, but if you've got a board that's got a lot of tension and interpersonal conflict, a lot of arguing, backbiting, people talking about each other outside of a meeting, those kind of things, these are the kinds of things that when the president becomes aware of these situations, they need to speak to the board chair and say, we need to address this. We can't make progress under these conditions.
Yeah. The dreaded meeting after the meeting, right? Yeah. I've always been one to believe that you're perhaps on the verge of dysfunction if a lot of meetings after the meeting are happening, that you're not able to have conversations in the board meeting for whatever the issue happens to be. So for board members who are listening, what would you say are some practical things that they can do to be more effective board members?
Well, at the top of my list would be to support the president. Trustees need to realize they have one employee, and it's their responsibility to have a regular performance review to address the president's spiritual, emotional, physical health. It can be very stressful leading a Bible college of any size today, and it doesn't have to be a school of 2,000 or 3,000. It can be a school of 100 or 200, and it's stressful to be in that position. And the president needs to know that the trustees have his or her back, that they've got a good working relationship with the board chair. And there's just needs to be this great sense of camaraderie and support and mutual trust between the president and the board. So I'd say that number one, support the president, make sure that their family is well cared for, make sure it's a good relationship with the president, because they're not easy to find.
You and I have sat in the seats of the president, and it's amazing how far a word of, hey, you're doing a great job, or hey, praying for you, gave this update, just know that I'm praying for you over this next week on this issue or that issue, how far that goes as an encouragement to a senior leader. And while they may know it, the fact that board members articulate that, it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. Just this past week, I had a conversation with the president of a university, and he was sharing with me how his trustees at the last meeting said to him, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm getting spread pretty thin. I'm kind of stressed out." And they said, "Well, what can we do to help you?" And they gave him permission to cut back on some things. So he was able to go back and they just say, I need to eliminate this. It's not an essential thing, but something that was a distraction, and he was able to cut back on a few things, which is good for your mental health and your time for your family and things.
Yeah. How else can board members encourage?
Well, I've referred to this earlier. I think if you expect your administration to provide you with a dashboard of key performance indicators, then you'll be a better trustee. And so make sure you've got that done. I think as trustees can be more effective if they make sure they have a really good governance committee on their board. That governance committee is where a lot of it starts. It's help when you're selecting your new trustees. Their job is to help orient trustees. So a governance committee that knows what their responsibilities are and fulfills them in a way that helps the board is critical to having being good trustees.
Yeah, great. Well, John, this has been a great conversation. We're coming close to the end here, but kind of pull back and from your coaching experiences, share with us your top 3 best practices that you see across the board that would translate regardless of whether you're college X or Y or Z. These would be best practices. Share with us 3 of those.
Let me reflect on the boards we work with, some of the things I really have grown to appreciate about them in the ABHE schools. One was I've been really impressed with the concern for the mission of the school. And when they buy into that mission and they know it and they appreciate it and they value it, that is one of the best practices I've seen among our boards so far. And then I think it's also been impressive how they have focused on spiritual issues. They dedicate themselves to prayer. They do understand that what they're doing has eternal consequences. And then I think the kind of support that I've seen from trustees, many of them, is just overwhelming. I'm not just talking about in terms of their attendance at meetings and that kind of thing, but their generosity that they've given to those schools and how much they believe in them. Those are just the kind of things that when you're committed and when you're sold out to what the school is all about, those are great practices. And it goes beyond, having dashboards and governance committees. It's more of a belief in what we're doing and the impact it's having.
Yeah. That's so well said. And, when you talk about it, it almost demystifies, when people serving on board, like it's got to be this complex thing. And it really doesn't have to be. I mean, the board member plays an important role and some of the things that they can do to encourage, but then also make sure that they're bringing their best are pretty down to earth kind of things. And a lot of times I find this with boards as I'm working with them and coaching, they don't need to reinvent the wheel. They've got a lot of the pieces in place. It's just these little tweaks along the way that you're making. I should say rare is an instance where I walk in and it's like, oh my goodness, we've got to start from square one. A lot of times, a lot of the good pieces are in place, and it's just a matter of tweaking things so that you're better as a board, that you're leading, that you're governing better. Well, this has been a great conversation, John. I really appreciate you, appreciate the work that you have invested, the time that you've invested in ABHE, not only as a president at ABHE schools, but then also coming in, helping out with the board governance. You've taken a leadership role that we all very, very much appreciate. So thank you for your involvement with ABHE.
Well, thank you, Philip. I've enjoyed it and I've absolutely loved every minute of it. Look forward to continuing to work with ABHE in this role.
Great.
Thank you.
And as we look forward to the coming years, we have board governance happening this year, but I would encourage you to be looking out for board governance training 2.0. As we've been working with the Murdoch Charitable Trust for a number of years, John is going to be taking the lead on how can we continue some of these training experiences beyond the coaching that we've been doing. So we'll be talking about some of those resources that are available to you as member institutions in the coming months. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.